Welcome, everyone. My name's Jennifer Hill, and I'm the Director of the Centre for Commercial Law and Regulatory Studies. And over there is my deputy, the tech guy, Dr. Steve Carabas. Before we get underway in tonight's seminar on doing business the Alibaba Ant Way, I wish to acknowledge the peoples of the Kulin Nations on whose land we are gathered today, and I do pay my respects to elders past and present and thank them for their focus on culture and history. I'm also very pleased that thanks to Steve, we are collaborating tonight with the Asian Corporate Law Forum, of which Monash Law and CLARS is a member, a very proud member of that group. And I believe that we have a number of ACLF members online throughout Asia. So welcome to them as well. On the 2nd of April, so just a couple of weeks ago, Thomas Friedman wrote an article in the New York Times, and it was entitled, "I Just Saw the Future, It Was Not America." And that's right, the future was China. And today in the Sydney Morning Herald, Peter Hartcher, he wrote and described Trump's 125% tariff on China as an act of economic warfare. Now, yesterday, I think it was 124%, and I described it as 125%, and someone corrected me, but today I think it is 125%, so it changed overnight. So the underlying theme to all these headlines is that China is now a global power and that it is challenging American hegemony. And so tonight's seminar, we're looking at this dramatic rise of China's economy, which is really exemplified in this Alibaba and Ant group, which have really been the rock stars of Chinese business. Even though they listed in America back in 2014. So we're very fortunate to have two experts on this topic to speak to us at a time when it really is so topical. Dr. Colin Hawes is an associate professor at the University of Technology in Sydney. He's in the Faculty of Law there. He teaches corporate law, Asian law, and Chinese business law. And he has an LLB and PhD in China Studies from the University of British Columbia in Canada. He also studied Chinese language at People's University in Beijing and Wuhan University, and he's published numerous books on Chinese corporate law, culture, etc. And his most recent, I think, is a Cambridge University Press book, 2022. I think the paperback edition's out in 2023, and that's the Chinese corporate ecosystem. And he regularly acts as an expert witness in international legal disputes involving Chinese business. We're also very fortunate to have up from Canberra today, Jenny Chen. And Jenny is going to be the commentator, speaking after Colin. Jenny is Relationship Director at Westpac Group Commercial Banking. She's also ACT President of the Australia-China Business Council, and she's Ambassador for Lululemon. I don't know how that came about, but also intriguing, Jenny. Jenny is a bilingual strategic management professional, and she's worked for over 18 years in leadership in commercial banking and strategic sales, etc. And she really works at the coalface in terms of business relationships with China. And she has a deep understanding of the cultural nuances, both at the Australian end and at the Chinese end, that go with building those relationships. So Colin's going to speak for 30 to 40 minutes, and then he's going to be followed by Jenny. So Colin, over to you.
So thank you to Professor Hill and to CLARS for inviting me to Melbourne, and also thanks to Jenny Chen for agreeing to be the commentator. Okay, just want to make sure the tech side is working. And okay, so the topic is doing business the Alibaba Ant Way, and together, together we're going to talk about why these private e-commerce and fintech firms are so important in China. And so that's going to involve talking about how do they fill gaps in the market that the state-owned enterprises can't fill. And secondly, how they've provided growth, economic growth, and various kinds of services to people in China and overseas. And they've helped to alleviate poverty, especially in the rural and hinterland areas of China. And there's also, they've collected huge amounts of data about their customers, and they've used that data to offer these customers financial products, which they otherwise wouldn't be able to have. So that's built up incredibly quickly, and it's led to various kinds of systemic risks with the Chinese economy, which that means that the Chinese government really has to respond to this. But there's a dilemma that the government faces, which is how to respond, how to regulate this new industry without stifling the economic growth that it brings. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. Now, you might have heard of Alibaba and Ant Group partly because there was a so-called crackdown on these two companies back in 2020. So Ant Group was going to have what was going to be the biggest IPO in the world ever, over $30 billion they were going to raise on the Shanghai Star Market and also being listed overseas. But it was suddenly suspended by the Chinese government in around November 2020. And the sister company of Ant Group, which is Alibaba, was also fined almost $3 billion for anti-monopoly violations. So, and various other of these e-commerce and fintech companies in China were also fined or regulated more strictly after this point. Now, Western commentators in the media, they assumed that this was some kind of power grab by the Chinese Communist Party, that they didn't like these private firms for some reason, and that they were just trying to assert control. But the situation is a lot more complex than that, and that's what I want to talk about today. So I'm focusing on Alibaba and Ant Group, but you have to realize that there's a lot of other of these e-commerce and fintech firms as well. So there's also Tencent, which does WeChat, and huge video game producer, including some of the most popular video games that people play in Australia. Baidu, which is internet search engine and an AI pioneer. We've got Didi Chuxing, which is a ride-hailing company like Uber. And then JD.com, another e-commerce firm, and TikTok, ByteDance. That firm does video streaming mainly. You've probably heard of them recently. And Temu and Pinduoduo, they are budget e-commerce. So they sell extremely cheap goods all over the world to consumers using their online platforms. So all of these firms have expanded hugely in the last 10 years or so. And they're all private companies. They're not state-owned companies. And most of these companies have been listed either in the United States or in Hong Kong. So they use complex kind of legal structure to do that. And they have expanded into financial services by first having payment systems that their customers can use to pay for the products, but then offering them financial products, investment products and loans and things like that. And so they've basically become like banks as well as e-commerce firms. And they've attracted between them billions of customers. So they're a major force that has emerged in the last 10 years especially. So as I said, I'm going to focus mainly on Alibaba and Ant Group because they're the biggest of these firms. But you have to remember that this is just one out of several. And so it's not just one company that the government has to think about. So if we look at Alibaba, Alibaba is the e-commerce side of the company, and then their related company is Ant Group, which is the financial side, right, of the company. I'll talk more about the government and the state-owned enterprises later. But if we zoom into the kind of businesses that they run. On the left side, the e-commerce side, Taobao is the platform where people can buy products online from millions of merchants. And so Taobao is the platform that you use, a bit like Amazon, right? So you can buy products online through that platform. But then there's a wholesale version of that where businesses can sell their products using the online platform to other businesses at wholesale prices. That's like Alibaba.com. And that happens both within China and overseas. And then they've also bought up some e-commerce companies in other countries, like Lazada is in Southeast Asia. It's one of the biggest e-commerce firms there. So, and then they've diversified, not just general e-commerce, but then they've got into food delivery. So Fresh Hippo is delivering groceries, often within 30 minutes of your order, you can get a load of groceries. And then Erlama, Kobe, those are delivering restaurant deliveries and drinks, you know, delivered to your door. And then Ali Health delivers medicines. And it's important in China because there are a lot of fake medicines which were not good for people's health being sold in regular stores. And Alibaba has set up this online system which guarantees that these medicines are authentic and coming from the original manufacturer right to your door. And then Fliggy is a ticketing, online ticketing like Expedia, one of those where you order travel tickets. So all these types of businesses all expanded, and then they have media and entertainment businesses like video streaming, Youku, and they make movies and TV dramas. They also have streaming of music. Their logistics is how they deliver the products physically to the customers, and they can deliver both within China and all over the world, right? And then they also provide business services such as cloud services and video conferencing, Ding Talk, right? So you can see it's a major conglomerate, not just one company, and they've attracted hundreds of millions of customers and merchants who sell on their platforms. Jenny, I think later is going to talk about how they did that and why there were gaps that needed to be filled in terms of all these customers that needed these products and services, right? But what I want to focus on more now is what did they do with all the data that they collected about these customers? Because when you buy things online, the company, which is Alibaba, they collect your data about what you're buying and how much you're paying, and merchants, what are you selling? They know pretty much how much money you have to spend. They can work out basically, are you a good customer? Do you pay for your products on time? All those, do you deliver your products on time? All those kind of things are useful data that this company Alibaba could use. And because they were using Alibaba's payment system to pay, which is called Alipay, they were able to collect all this data, and they used it to then offer products, financial products, to these people. So they worked out who was a good credit risk, they could offer loans to them, or who was someone who might want to invest their spare cash, they would offer investment products. And then insurance, they thought, oh, these people might need insurance, we'll offer that to them. So that's how they took this data from all their e-commerce customers, they passed it over to their finance arm, which was Ant Group, and then Ant Group was able to offer all these products, the financial products, and that was a hugely expanding business since around 2011. And you can see from their prospectus, this was in 2020, how many customers they actually managed to attract. You know, apart from the billion people using their payment services and 80 million plus merchants allowing people to pay with Alipay, they also have over 700 million people using their financial products or buying the financial products that are offered on their platforms. And they partner with over 2,000 financial institutions to do this. And so there's hundreds of billions of dollars going through, whether it's in loans or investment products, going through these platform finance companies, which we call fintech, right? Financial technology companies. Now, when you look at how they actually did these financial products, Alibaba and Ant Group, they claim that we are not actually a bank. What we are a platform that allows people to buy these products. And the actual people selling those products were state-owned banks, insurance firms, and finance firms. Often finance firms are controlled by children of senior Communist Party leaders in China. And so what Ant did was basically identify potential customers using their data and then recommend them to these financial firms and work with those firms to customize their products for those kind of investors, which were often small businesses or individuals. And then those firms would sell the product to those people. But when you bought those products as a customer, you probably thought, oh, I'm dealing with Alibaba or Ant Group, because that's where you found it on their platform. And it was often marketed by Alibaba and Ant Group as well. So it was a bit confusing for customers what they were actually getting into, right? And this expanded so quickly. Initially, the Chinese government, which is the regulators on the top right of the screen, they had a very kind of hands-off attitude because this was really successful and it was helping to grow the economy. It was helping to get people into kind of growing their wealth in a way that they could never have done before. Also good for small businesses, of course, yeah. But after about 2015, the Chinese government started to get worried about this because of the fast expansion. And that brings us to what I call the Chinese government's dilemma. Because on the one hand, there's real benefits to this e-commerce and fintech, both in terms of fulfilling demand for consumer goods and for solving the distribution problems of getting products to the market. Used to be a real headache in China to deliver goods in different parts of the country or overseas. They've solved that problem with their logistics systems and AI, using AI to deliver things in the most efficient way possible, right? They've also helped to alleviate poverty, providing employment. They've satisfied this huge thirst for investment among individuals and small enterprises. They have a bit of disposable cash. They want to invest it, but the traditional banks and the stock markets were not a very good return. And so by providing all these new products for them with better returns, they've satisfied that thirst among ordinary people and small businesses to get a return on their investments. That also benefits the state-owned banks and the financial firms. It's good for them as well as partners of Alibaba and Ant. And it's helped to provide funding for local governments that have been very cash-strapped in recent years, allowing them to build infrastructure, for example, and for businesses that needed to raise money, but they couldn't access money from traditional banking systems. So this is all great, right? And these firms have also helped the government provide its own services more efficiently. For example, in many Chinese cities, you can now pay your taxes using Alipay or WeChat Pay, which is very easy, you know, and courts are able to enforce their judgments more efficiently, because if you get a debt that you're supposed to pay, the court orders you to pay, they can get these e-commerce firms to blacklist those people until they pay off their debt. And so they find it difficult to buy products online if they don't pay off their debt, or to buy travel tickets, you know. So these companies were helping the government do its job, and I guess giving a positive view of the government to ordinary Chinese people. And that led to economic growth. And in theory, it should have led to social stability, because people should have been more happy by being richer. But then you come to the other side of the dilemma, which is the systemic risks that were building up over the years because of the huge rapid expansion of this whole business and industry sector. And the bad behavior of these e-commerce and fintech firms didn't help either, right? Now, one issue was with huge numbers of fake products and often unsafe food products that were being sold on some of these platforms, and they just couldn't keep track of them. Secondly, they were engaging in monopolistic practices, which is, as say Alibaba would say to a merchant, you can only have your products on our platform. If you advertise your products on a different platform, like Tencent's WeChat platforms or some other e-commerce, JD.com, right, then we will put your search results right down to the bottom so nobody can find you. Or we will give you a bad credit rating so you can't borrow money, you know. So those were monopolistic practices preventing people from having a freedom to advertise their products wherever they wanted. And that was very common among all these different platform firms. You can't quite see the thing which says about data protection. There was an issue with that because all this data was being collected by these firms and used by them without often the customer's consent. And so you had all these kind of predatory financial firms trying to sell products to people using their data and personal data, right? And almost harassing them to try and buy financial products. And it was pretty kind of frustrating for many people having to deal with this every day on their phone. Things would come up and say, buy this product. And it was unclear what the legal liability, that's hidden by the other box there. The legal liabilities were unclear. Like if something went wrong with your investment product, you thought you were dealing with Alibaba or Ant Group, but actually it was some shady financial firm that you signed the contract with, and they've gone out of business and you can't get your money back from them or from Alibaba. So these were some of the systemic risks that were building up. And they came to a head around 2015 when huge numbers of those so-called peer-to-peer lending firms collapsed. And these were firms that were allowing ordinary people to invest and support businesses. And many of those businesses failed and they didn't pay back the loans to the investors. Millions of ordinary citizens lost their savings because of these collapsing investment firms. And they went out on the streets and protesting outside Chinese government offices. The top right corner is one of those protests, which has already been, I guess, broken up by the police. But so that was one issue. And the Chinese government gets really worried when the people go out on the streets because they're really concerned about social chaos, right? Secondly, all the money sloshing around in the system of investments and going into kind of products that you didn't really know, it wasn't very well regulated, right? It led to this property bubble and industrial overcapacity. So many of these property developers expanded incredibly quickly, and some of them started to collapse around 2019 to 20, especially Evergrande and a couple of others you might have heard of. And so the economic situation was very unstable around this time. So you'd think that the e-commerce firms would then step back a bit, slow things down, maybe submit to a bit more control. But actually the opposite happened. And that's what led to what I call a temporary slap on the wrist by the government and tighter regulation. And the catalyst for this was a speech made by the founder of Ant Group and Alibaba, Jack Ma, in October 2020, where he basically said, we don't need to be regulated by the government, the bank regulators, because we know how to assess our customers and how to see whether they're a good credit risk. We know how to recommend the financial products to them, to the financial institution. We have low rates of people not paying their loans off. But So he even said that bank regulators are a bunch of old men who are out of touch with the new technology, fintech, etc. But he gave that speech to a group of Chinese bank regulators, and the vice president of China happened to be there as well. So that was kind of the wrong thing to do at this time when there was so much instability and these peer-to-peer lenders all collapsing. It was a really bad thing to do. And it was just before the IPO of Ant Group was going to go ahead. So the Communist Party basically stopped that IPO. They didn't want this company getting even bigger and more powerful and not submitting to regulation. And they pretty much forced them to turn into a financial holding company like a bank. In other words, to have a clearer kind of capital requirements and to make sure that customers who bought financial products knew exactly who they were buying them from. And Alibaba and Ant Group had to take on some of the risk of those products failing. So that's one thing. And then other fintech firms were also impacted, like Didi Chuxing. Their IPO was scuppered in New York and had to move to Hong Kong. Other companies like the e-commerce companies, whether it's Alibaba, JD.com, they were all fined for their monopolistic practices. So it was a kind of a crackdown, but it was important to do that because of all these risks that are built up and the bad practices and the popular frustration with a lot of these companies, right? It wasn't just a power grab by the Communist Party. And also, it hasn't really resolved this dilemma of the Chinese government, which is how to regulate the economy, fintech, e-commerce, without stifling economic growth. And you'll find that this year, end of last year, early this year, the Chinese government is now trying to encourage the private firms again by saying we'll loosen some of the regulations. Xi Jinping recently met with a group of private business people, including the top tech firm CEOs, and saying we want to encourage you, tell us what your concerns are, etc. Because the Chinese government can't really do without these firms anymore. A scholar called Zhou Xueguang, he's come up with a theory which is based on the last 30 or 40 years of Chinese government economic reform, basically saying that the government goes through these cycles where they allow local governments and businesses to innovate, to be autonomous, to develop new kind of business models. They grow very quickly, but then it often leads to negative consequences because they're not being regulated. And then eventually the government has to step in and tighten control. They usually go too far and stifle the economy for a while, and then they have to open up again. So it's a kind of constant cycle. And you could say that it's not that different from what happens in other countries in terms of the so-called crackdown, like in the US and internationally, there's this futile attempt to regulate the big tech firms and the finance, the banks, the big banks, right? And they're constantly coming up with new scandals. And then they say, oh, it won't happen again if you just let us run our businesses. So it's not that different from the Chinese situation, right? We've become dependent on these private firms and in a kind of symbiotic codependency that we can't do without them anymore. So those are the Alibaba, Ant Group, and the fintech firms. I want to slightly move back a bit to the bigger picture and how this relates to what I call the Chinese corporate and political ecosystem, which is a lot more complex than many people think, right? And so a common view of the Chinese government and the Communist Party is that it is basically a pyramid of control, very strictly controlled from the top with Xi Jinping, the supreme leader, and then a small number of Politburo standing committee members, and then down through the party. And the party is able to control the society through all levels of government institutes. So they have their party members leading or infiltrated into all types of institutions in China, including government, state-owned enterprises, police, the courts, universities, even private enterprises have to set up Communist Party committees within them. And so it seems like the Communist Party is controlling everything from the top. But in fact, it's a lot more complex than that because of several factors like self-interest, the self-interest of all the people involved here, not just the corporations, but government officials themselves. They have their own interests, their personal interests. And guanxi is like personal relationship networks, which are very important for people to do business and to just to get along in China. They often get in the way of Chinese government or party control over businesses, and corruption sometimes plays a role as well. So all these things muddy the waters, they subvert the pyramid of control of the Communist Party, and they allow a certain level of freedom, especially during periods of opening up or autonomy, right? So instead of looking at the Chinese corporate political system as a pyramid, I think it makes more sense to look at it like this diagram, the circular kind of, if you imagine this circle moving around and full of energy, and this is a maelstrom, frequently chaotic maelstrom of corporate political networks, which are interacting together at every single level and often subverting the government and party as they do it. So it's not a pyramid, but a sort of yin-yang circulation of constant change and struggle for supremacy. That is, I think, a more realistic way of looking at the system in China than a very fixed triangle pyramid, right? And so if we superimpose those e-commerce and fintech firms on this, you get the TikTok, ByteDance, Alibaba, and Tencent, their own ecosystems, all competing with each other. And they have their own corporate interests, which is to expand and make as much money as possible. And within them, because they're platforms, they also have hundreds of millions of merchants and customers interacting on their platforms as well. So it's not just a company, it's a whole ecosystem, right? Working for their own interest. And then they interact with the Chinese government in different ways, but it's not one way at all. They can often lobby and have lobbied the Chinese government and the party to get policies that are good for them, right? And because the Chinese government itself is not unified, often there's many competing interests within the government. Some of them are more business friendly, some are more focused on ideology or security. They also have to come to some kind of resolution of the tensions. So this situation is very fluid, always changing, and the companies take advantage of that to grow as fast as they can. But if they go too far and it leads to social instability and possible financial meltdown, then the Chinese government becomes more unified. They crack down, at least temporarily, and make sure things don't fall apart, right? So that's what I mean by the Chinese corporate political ecosystem and how it maybe interacts with these e-commerce and fintech firms. So, I also want to just go back, think about why this is relevant for Australian businesses, because this ecosystem in China is not isolated. There's constant interactions with the international corporate political ecosystems. And so we can't ignore it. It's going to affect us whether we like it or not. And so we have huge import and exports with China from Australia and other countries, obviously, both in e-commerce and actual on-the-ground trade, right? Sanctions and tariffs constantly kind of impact that relationship. A few years ago, Australia was subject to these what you might call informal blocks of some of its products going to China when we had a tense relationship with China. Those have been resolved mainly, but now we've got the US imposing various sanctions and tariffs. It might affect us in other ways. Many of these Chinese firms have foreign investors. Their shareholders often are foreign investors, right? And so they will be impacted if these companies either succeed or fail. there's the issue of data protection. So a company like TikTok operates all over the world. They're collecting data of their users. We don't really know what they're using it for. I'm not certain that it's being used by the Chinese Communist Party, but it's certainly being used by the companies to try and manipulate their customers into buying more products or whatever. So we're not really sure exactly how they're using that data. And then these companies have also disrupted traditional ways of doing business and banking. So I don't know if any of you have bought something on Taobao or one of these online platforms recently. It's something that you wouldn't have been able to do probably even 10 or 15 years ago. But now you can just order something and it comes from China and arrives on your doorstep in a few days, you know. So it's disrupting the local businesses here because they have to learn how to deal with that and possibly improve their own services, right? Especially the banks. Yeah. So that's just a kind of, why is this important for Australians, right? And then just to finish off with, I want to look at the even bigger picture, which is the impact of this whole ecosystem on the natural environment, the natural ecosystem, if you like, because it's really good if China has economic growth. It's good for its people that they can have a better standard of living. But when people have more money, they want to buy more products. They need more resources to make those products. And it leads to a huge use of energy, right? And so if you look at the figures on the left-hand side for Chinese coal production, although the Chinese government has made huge efforts to reduce its reliance on coal for energy, for electricity production, right? They've reduced it from 70% of energy production to 58% between 2004 and 2019, which is a huge drop, right? But in terms of the actual amount of coal that is being used, the tons of coal, it's gone up by 3 times in that period because the economy has grown so much over that same period. So the percentage is down, but the actual amount is up. And that's a real issue that China and other countries are going to have to grapple with if we're going to deal with the global warming and climate change. That's at the company level, it's a similar situation. So Alibaba, they've achieved 70% reduction in use of new packaging. In other words, they're using recycled packaging for 70% more of their packages than they used to five years ago, which again is great progress. It's saving lots of trees, I guess. But the problem is they've expanded so quickly during that period that the amount of packaging that they produce is probably just as much, as it says in non-recycled packaging, is just as much as the total amount that they produced 5 years ago. So, how are they going to deal with this continuous kind of growth? It's a pretty insoluble or possibly insoluble problem. And that affects both their use of energy for their servers and AI data centers and all that kind of thing, and also their logistics or delivery. All use energy, all needs to be somehow turned into renewable rather than coal. So you can see why that kind of thing, magnified among all of China's industries, has led to the increase in coal tonnage, even though they're reducing the percentage, right? So I don't know exactly how to solve that problem. Hopefully some of you can deal with it. It's going to be a major, needs an international kind of approach. There was maybe an alternative approach in the past in China, a mix of Taoism and Confucianism, which focused a lot on harmonious relationships, whether in China or between China and other countries, and a balance between the natural world and the human world, not upsetting that ecological balance, equilibrium rather than growth. In other words, learning to be satisfied with what you have rather than always wanting more. But I think that's almost disappeared from China and from other countries as well. And so whether we can bring it back or not with a more sustainable kind of approach to business and to economic growth, I'm not really sure. I'm an optimist, but I think it's going to be a major operation. So I'll stop there, and hopefully Jenny can provide her own perspective on these issues. And if you have questions, I guess we can deal with them afterwards. Yeah.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jenny Chen from Canberra. I'm very excited to be here, not just because it's my first time at Monash University, or because I'm in Melbourne, I get to catch up with my best girlfriend and her family, but it's because I'm here and I can share something that what I see is quite interesting and relevant to every one of you who has a smartphone. So when Colin and I first caught up talking about today's seminar, I made a comment about I haven't actually used Alibaba for the past 4 or 5 years. And here comes the professor's question. Why is that, Jenny? And what that make you think? So then I really start thinking about what is Chinese e-commerce and how did we actually get here? So when we talk about Chinese e-commerce, this is probably what you think. Picture of Shanghai, my hometown, and that's where I grew up. Population of 26 million people, GDP of 757 billion US dollars. But we might have forgotten, wasn't long ago, about 40 years ago, China was a planned economy. And I remember my parents telling me that they had to rely on vouchers before they had money to purchase basic goods, such as salt, sugar, flour, meat, you name it. And it wasn't just one particular city or province, it was all over China. So the consumer behaviors and culture was very much shaped by scarcity. And this is how the background of the backdrop of the early modern China and the consumer behaviors. And we all know when this very clever man, Jackie Ma, was in Hangzhou and formed with his 17 friends in the back of a leased apartment back in 1999 for Alibaba. The purpose at the time was very much about B2B. In an era with not many people has internet in China at the time, it wasn't very widely known. But that was the beginning of very much of the e-commerce era in China. Then we had SARS, 2003. At the time, very much so, the consumer behaviors and the shopping habits were very much captured by the local shopping centers, the fresh markets. And the procurement process is very much about what do we actually need, what we look at for the local custom, and people like me that is in Shanghai that we very much still quite like sweet and sour stuff, and people from the north will more appreciate salty. And why would you actually source stuff that you don't think people will buy? So very much so, the goods and choices are still quite limited. But then we had us, which we had then the fear of public spaces and led to a lot of the online shopping boom. And then also we had, like what Colin mentioned, there is a lot of other platforms all of a sudden started. We have the Jingdong, which is more specialized or targeted white goods platform. But there was a real shift in the consumer habits and the seller search. Because now all of a sudden, you're not just reaching of your local economy, you're actually reaching out the entire country. And this is then leads to the next 10 years of the e-economy e-commerce expansion. What I like to cover a little bit here is what I observe of the mobile banking digital payment system. In China, in the very early of the 2000s, there was roughly about 65% of the people still living in rural areas. When I say rural area, I'm not talking about regional New South Wales here that you still have very good connection and Wagga, say for example, it's still, I can access sushi, for example, in these regional areas. These are people have never used cards, didn't have credit system. So you have people in China at the time all of a sudden using cash, and then you have this very reliable from their perspective of their online shopping platform can provide them with a digital wallet. So there's no credit card system, there's no passbook in a way, and there's no checks. Whereas what I see here in Australia in comparison is that we have a very long-standing credit system here. People are very used to credit cards. So I remember the big four banks here, and there was the first one roll out Apple Pay, and it took a long time for the other banks to actually adapt it because they're not too sure if Australian consumers will actually like it. Whereas on the other side, Chinese consumers just went straight to mobile payment system, and especially of WeChat and Alipay, because they are getting a much better return compared to how they get and what they get from their traditional banks. And there comes the technology and based convenience and logistics. So these are very common logos for most of the Chinese consumers in the 2000s and 2010s. Then, of course, we had COVID. And what I observed, again, the difference between the two countries are the lockdowns are real in China, which means there's no 1 hour to go and do your shopping. You can't walk your dog. You're actually locked in. So on the back of that, the whole society was basically rely on the e-commerce delivery system because you simply can't go out. Hence why at the time, there was a huge boom of e-commerce during COVID times. And that was a real accessory at the time of COVID. The only time people actually leave their places is to do their COVID testing. So, and other times that they just require to stay at home and in the lockdown scenario. So these fresh markets, these local malls, pretty much all empty. And I will cover a little bit of the essential infrastructure, which the delivery riders is actually a very big part of the e-commerce ecosystem as well. And this is also at the time, and what I see as e-commerce market in China has grown into something like $2.16 trillion US dollars back in 2024 now. During COVID, because of the lockdowns, what we saw was a real rise of the influencer marketing. So while people were sitting at home and looking at their mobile devices, this is when they started to following a lot of the key opinion leaders. Some of, especially TikTok of the world. I remember visiting my mom last year, April, in Shanghai, and she started following this free dance class in the morning every hour or so. And once this dance lady as a key opinion leader doing her class, then she started showing of what she purchased, what she would recommend for a top or a hat. And my mom in her 70s quite comfortably will just place an order. And the order just doesn't stop there. It's about the whole consumer experience. So not only that you will purchase apparently at a much cheaper price compared to what you will usually access to go to a shopping mall, but at the same time, free delivery and guaranteed. So my mom, when I visited, bought something equivalent to about $5 for a hat. Turned up the next day in the delivery, and it happened to be the wrong color. I was quite happy with that because for $5, you can't really get too much here in Australia. But my mom said, no, I need to feedback. They gave me the wrong color. So she did. And what they did was really amazed me. One is that they did a full refund of the $5. And two, that they offered my mom to return and keep her hat. For someone like my mom's age, the whole experience really gave her the full confidence of online shopping. And that tells you the whole experience is not just coming from someone who you regularly see that teach you how to dance, someone you see as a trusted person online, but also the whole purchase experience is really smooth. When things go wrong, what you see as they send you the wrong color. And this is the reason why some of the KOLs I know overnight, one night can make 100 million RMB for GMV, so gross market value. So that's how what I see as quite crazy. The advantage of that, of course, is that what Colin mentioned about it gives a lot of businesses the access from people that from areas that will never be able to sell their goods, but also at the same time, there's a lot of governance required because the mass is just too big. And what I like to talk a little bit, which I found again quite interesting, is about the delivery riders in China. Unofficial figure, but there's about 60 million delivery riders in China. It's a very scary figure, and at the same time, about 30% of the delivery riders actually got bachelor degree or better. And what I see is a number of reasons. One is that the younger cohorts, when they finish university, they don't want to go through the corporate ladder anymore. They don't want the 9-to-5 job. They want something that will actually fit them better. They want freedom. They want to be their own boss. And also, if you look at the pay structure as well, for someone that might not be the 201 of the top universities, but if you get through your uni and you get a junior job at a corporate firm, you're making in China about, let's say, 3,000 or 4,000 a month. But if you be your own boss and do a delivery rider's job, you make about 10,000. So you do the math. For someone that's actually starting up, why not? And this is the reason why there's a lot of people actually now choosing to be a delivery rider. And consciously knowing that maybe traditionally it's not that a well-respected job, but it's something that will make themselves feel happy. And also because of the e-commerce economy just becoming so big. And they are the backbone of the whole experiences. I came back from Beijing and Shanghai in December last year, and I was sitting at home and I wanted an ice cream. And I didn't want to change and go downstairs to queue up and get my ice cream, so I ordered online. And within 10 minutes, I had my ice cream unmelted in my hand. And that is the experience what I was talking about. And all of that, and the delivery riders is all part of that. So here's the China e-commerce figure. I'm at a law school, so I'm not going to talk too much about the legal framework, but what I do want to share a little bit is my observation around the Alibaba way. What I see is the very early on, back what I shared in the 1999 when Alibaba was formed, it's more how I see it, it's very much like the company has set up like a highway. At the very start, you allow all vehicles to get on. With seatbelts, no airbags, and you just let all products to get on. Later on, you start to build your regulatory requirements. You ask for more safety measures. You ask for what they call the 3 certificates from the suppliers. But then because of that reason, a lot of companies actually can't get onto the Alibaba platform because it's too costly. They don't have the right operation to do that. And at the time, there was a very, very big group. There's nothing wrong with their products. Might be a bit cheaper, might not have the certificates that what Alibaba wanted. And then it's interesting now, it's the 3rd largest platform now in China. It's called Pinduoduo. It's the Tmall version in the original version in China. What that really means is that buy together, get cheaper. And this is what the consumers actually wanted. At the very start of Pinduoduo, it's just cheap and nasty stuff. But people didn't mind paying a cheap stuff and then use it for 12 months and just let it go. Now Pinduoduo is really making its way, and they have really amazing stuff there. And most recently, I think a couple of weeks ago, Tmall here in Australia now allowing the local Australian suppliers to get on their platform as well. So it will provide a lot more choices to the consumers, but of course it will be some disruptions to the local businesses as well. Just in the end, what I like to touch is about the AI of the world and e-commerce. Whether we like it or not, AI is everywhere. AI is on our phone, and if we use the right, we can make our life a lot easier. And this is what a lot of the e-commerce and a lot of the smart commerce businesses actually all using. So the difference what I see between a TikTok and Instagram or Facebook of the world is that you actively follow some of the influencers or celebrities or family or friends. But TikTok, it will actually know your interest. It will use AI and the big data to know you've actually watched that video 10 seconds longer than another video. And it knows that you've been to tennis, say, for example. So it knows your interest. It will push out the right video at the right time. And if you are selling a particular products, it's about getting your consumer. It goes back to what they actually need. Sometimes there are jokes about when you actually go for a blind date, you don't need to ask questions. You just ask for their TikTok account. You see their interest and you see what they've been buying. You know exactly what that kind of person there is. And I have seen some of the large firms in China has been using AI to forecast for inventory, to forecast for staffing. And it is an area what I see as a lot of opportunities to improve efficiency for businesses. Of course, it requires a lot of regulatory and governance, but at the same time, it is about listening to what the consumers actually need as well as what they want. So in conclusion, I really think that the AI and e-commerce of the world is exciting because it provides consumers with a lot of more choices. It does make the landscape a lot more competitive because you have to work a bit harder as a business. But I truly believe when there is trade, there's no war. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Jenny and Colin, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I've got a lot of questions, but I want to open it up to the floor. My first question is, what flavour ice cream was it, though? That is like the big one. And then I've got a few about dual class stock if nobody else has got questions. But do you remember what flavour ice cream it was? No, not Messina. So do we have questions? Because we'll need to pass around the mic. The questions. I can't believe you don't have questions. Yes. Oh, thanks, Steve. Yeah, he's got longer legs, so he gets there faster. Yeah.
Does it work now? Oh, beautiful. Thank you so much for the presentations. They were both brilliant. And for a person who is coming from Western economy, it was really interesting to have a glimpse in the Chinese culture and the state of the economy. And if that's okay, I will have one question to each of you. So Colin, to you, my question would be how the expansion of digital ecosystem in China differs from the expansion of digital ecosystem in Western countries. And I was wondering, we have Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, and it seems that right now there is a trend to investing into AI and cloud. And I was wondering, what are maybe not the core platform services, but the emerging services that Chinese platforms might invest in?
Thanks. Yeah. So I think one difference between these Chinese firms and some of the Western ones is that they tend to be a lot more diversified into many different types of business, like, WeChat, for example, which is Tencent. You can use WeChat for all sorts of different kind of functions, rather than you think of Amazon basically is about buying and selling things online, right? But some of these Chinese kind of platforms, you can do that, and you can communicate, you can do all sorts of video games, you can do pay your bills, etc., etc. So I think these companies probably have even more influence over people's whole life. They basically that's one of the slogans of Alibaba, is we want you to be using Alibaba for everything you do, pretty much. So that's a paraphrase, but yeah. But in terms of the emerging things, I mean, one of the obvious ones is things like self-driving cars and e-vehicles, electric vehicles. Some of these companies like Alibaba have invested in that, but not just for people to buy, like consumers to buy, but for their own businesses. So a lot of their factories, for example, are using autonomous vehicles and delivery on the streets. You can see these robot type vehicles going around the streets delivering their products. And my wife went to China recently and said, in the hotel, the room service was done by robots, So there's a lot more, I think, advanced in terms of that idea. Partly, I think, because the Chinese population is starting to go down. It's an aging population, and there might not be enough people to provide those kind of services. So they have to develop that kind of robots and autonomous type devices so that they can provide the services that people need. Yeah, I probably shouldn't go on too long, though. That's one aspect.
Did you have a question for Jenny as well, did you say?
Yes,
yeah.
If that's okay. Thank you so much. That was really interesting answer. And I'm looking forward to digital caring economy then in China. And yeah, I had a chance to use WeChat, and it seems like a multi-app in a sense. It's really different from what we know here. And Jenny, for you, my question will center around sharing economy or like delivery drivers. So I think in Western countries with Uber in 2008, we have this big dream about partner drivers and how amazing, how flexible that work is. But later on, we discovered that actually they are constantly less and less paid. And even though it was very good pay at the beginning, now the longer you work and the more you work, it's less beneficial for the drivers. And they are not protected in the sense they won't have superannuation, then don't have maternity leave. There might be some conflicts. There is the problem of the liability. And I was wondering what's the situation in China, and whether you think that this idea might be very positive now, but maybe it will decrease over time as it did in our culture, in our economy, or whether you think that the growth might look different in the future.
Thanks, a great observation. I also see a problem there as well, but it's also similar to the Alibaba of the world. Once you become too big, hence why you have so many delivery riders. And if some of the parts of the economy or the e-commerce businesses goes down, then what happens to these delivery riders? The welfare of the delivery riders is a question, because there are very rigorous requirements for the riders to deliver items on time, and there are countless accidents or deaths because of they missing delivery time by a minute and they actually lose their bonus. There's a whole problem system around what is actually required to be done. There is no one solution to that at the moment, but at the same time, it is one is aging population is a big issue in China at the moment. Two is that people are very used to a very busy and efficient experience, and they want that. So how do you solve that? Hence why I really think that there's a solution in AI, and how we actually use technology the right way. So I remain quite positive around what's possible, but great observation.
I think there was an issue with Domino's Pizza a few years ago of that drivers, rushing to get delivery on time so they didn't lose their bonus and killing people or killing someone. We've got another question up the back, I understand. Could you just tell us who you are?
Like, what do you want to know?
I know, just, yeah.
Hi, I'm Alwyn. I work with Telstra. I'm a consultant there. I'm just curious. I don't know this is whether the right question for me to ask in this kind of forum, but if we look into like e-commerce is the way to go, have we thought about like failures, like the fallbacks and the pain points from that? And what I mean by that is, say hypothetically, there's a macro environment issue and there's like cyber attacks, cybersecurity frauds, also solar flares, basically wiping out the whole AI, the internet on the cloud base. Has there been thought about, in sense like China's leading towards the way of doing e-commerce, is there a fallback? And are we also looking into in like the Western country, do we have a fallback when these kind of situation happens? Because right now I can see in the economy with Australians, we're leaning towards a cashless route, but what if that does happen? So I don't know whether it's the right question for me to ask in this forum. Yeah.
I'll speak a little bit and I'll pass on to Colin. So speaking from a law school, my observation of some of these society behaviors is that laws always seems to be a few years later after the behaviors of the businesses practice or the consumer preferences. And there are a lot of talks, and you will see at the time for the MOFCOM, Ministry of Foreign Commerce in China, how when they really seriously introduced e-commerce laws, it wasn't until something like 2019, whereas we talked about Alibaba of the world really started back in 1999. So there's a lot has happened amongst these years. It takes time, but also same thing as what we are talking about, technology. And I remember was in a lunch with AFP, Australian Federal Police, actually. So they give me an example of it. It used to be that protecting your family means you lock doors and your kids, say for example, make sure the window is actually locked and you don't have the bad person to get in. But now with internet, with scammers, it's actually a lot harder to really protect your family in a way because of the way how society is moving forward. It is difficult, but I think that with the right behaviors as well, while we actually observe the right way to do things, and I do think it's possible. It might take some time for sure for the law reinforcement, but I think it's possible.
Thanks. I think that's also a really good question in terms of what happens if some of these systems fail in terms of technologically, there's some kind of cyber attack or something that brings down the systems, and really they are totally dependent on those networks, those systems that tell them how to deliver, what to deliver, and when to do it. I mean, it's down to the minutes or whatever. You send something from China to Australia or to the US, they know exactly how long it's going to take and what route it's going to take. But if the system's down, they won't be able to do any of that. We have to go back to paper and pen, I guess. I mean, and people will have forgotten how to do it. So I think it's quite worrying. The only thing is you need to, I suppose, build in a sort of backup systems or something. I'm not a technical person, so I don't know how it works, but it is pretty worrying, you know, if we rely too much on technology and then it fails. Yeah, yeah.
Just a quick observation. When I visited China for the first time last year, and I was using online, everything was online. And the final trip that I had was a cab to the airport, and the Alipay, it didn't work. And I just happened to have some cash, and I gave him cash, but he didn't have enough change. So the resolution was that he got a lot of money in cash because the system failed.
I think Jenny's point's a really good one too. I think the thing that really encapsulates what's happened in China is that the law right from the get-go has been played catch up. It's like the genie was out of the bottle and then the law just goes running behind it. And, you know, you see that in all the corporate law aspects. We're going to wrap up because I've got a very hard deadline tonight. Well, Colin does, because he's got to fly back to Sydney. And I want to get him and Jenny up on the stage so I can photograph them against this. So thank you, everyone, very much for coming in person. And for those of you online at the Asian Corporate Law Forum, we loved being in Bangkok with you. And we look forward to seeing you in Kuala Lumpur next year. So if you can thank Colin and Jenny, great presentations.